Today, we're diving into a really fascinating text from 1882 called The Ministry of Healing. And what's so interesting about it is that it takes one of the most famous lines in all of Christian prayer and basically argues that for centuries, we've gotten its meaning completely backwards, especially when it comes to being sick.
So, the whole book really hinges on his radical rethinking of a single very familiar prayer. The author, a guy named A.J. Gordon, was convinced that for generations, people had profoundly misunderstood what it was really all about.
And here it is. This is the puzzle at the very heart of the book. When we say, "Thy will be done," when we're facing an illness, does that mean we're just supposed to accept our fate? Or, and this is the big twist, are we actually being called to do the exact opposite, to fight back? Gordon puts this question right to his readers. He's asking, why is it that our gut reaction when we hear this prayer is to connect it with suffering, with pain, with loss? He argues this isn't just being pessimistic, it's a fundamental misreading of the prayer's original and much more powerful intent.
So, let's get into the book's core answer. It's a pretty big idea that completely reframes the whole relationship between God's will and human sickness. It's really all about trying to turn a prayer of resignation into a powerful call to action. And this right here really lays out the two sides of the argument perfectly. On the one hand, you have the common view. You get sick, you patiently submit. But Gordon's view is the complete opposite. He says that prayer is actually an active command to battle sickness, because sickness itself is the very thing that's contrary to God's will.
And to make his point, Gordon uses this really powerful metaphor from farming. He says sickness isn't some tool that a loving God uses. No, it's like weeds or tares that an enemy has secretly planted in a farmer's field. And what do you do with weeds? You don't just accept them, you actively work to rip them out. So here's the crucial point where it all comes together. The prayer itself gives us the blueprint. It asks for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, according to Gordon, there's no sickness in heaven. So he argues the prayer is basically an aggressive demand for that same reality, a world without sickness, to be established right here, right now.
But the author doesn't just stop with a theological argument. To prove that this isn't some brand new idea, but actually a lost practice, he turns to what he sees as historical evidence of faith healing down through the ages.
And what's really interesting here is how he pushes back against that common belief that the age of miracles just ended, with the original apostles. He's making the case that the gift of healing has actually been this continuous, if sometimes forgotten, thread throughout church history. So he lays out this kind of historical breadcrumb trail. He starts way back with the writings of the early church leaders, then he jumps way forward to the practices of early Baptist and colonial America, and he finishes with someone who was actually alive in his own time, a pastor in 19th century Germany. For his first point, he pulls out quotes like this one from the early church father Tertullian. And what's being described here is a Christian named Proculus healing the actual Roman emperor. And this isn't some ancient legend for the writer, it was a contemporary event. Then we leap forward more than 1,500 years to early America. He brings up this historical work on American Baptists that talks about pastors using anointing with oil. They called it a salutary unction to get these surprising immediate cures for things like really severe injuries from a wagon accident. And finally, just to show this isn't only ancient history, he points to a man from his own era, Pastor Blumhardt. According to the accounts Gordon uses, this pastor's ministry of healing became so well known that literally hundreds and thousands of people traveled to his tiny village from all over Europe, all looking for healing. All right, so after making his case with theology and history, Gordon then shifts gears and gets really practical. He offers some very direct advice, but he splits it into two different categories. One for the person who is praying for someone else to be healed, and another for the person who is actually sick. And you can see that distinction really clearly here. For the person trying to be a healer, the bar is set incredibly high, intense spiritual focus, total surrender. But for the person who is sick, the message is radically simple. You don't have to fix yourself or get to some level of spiritual perfection first. Nope, the only requirement is faith. So, where does all of this leave us? I mean, what are we supposed to make of this book? The author back in 1882 presented it not as some new idea he came up with, but as the recovery of a vital, forgotten doctrine that was supposed to be at the very heart of his faith. And that's really the thing. This 19th century text leaves us with a pretty challenging question for our 21st century minds. It really forces us to think about that complex relationship between faith and health, between ancient beliefs and modern science, and it asks us to think a little more critically about how we interpret history and even the prayers we might say every day without a second thought.